Lake George, New York, December 24th. A daughter is watching her family erase her history. The heavy snow buries the Grant estate in silence, but inside the air is thick with a cruel ambush. Alexa Grant came home for Christmas only to be handed a gift that mocks her existence and a toast that denies her life. She realizes the empty chairs at her wedding weren't an accident, they were a deletion. But tonight, the extra child isn't just watching. She is holding the digital evidence that will expose her father's perfect image as a fraud. He thinks he can write her out of the will. She is about to write him out of her life. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. The driveway to the Grant estate always felt less like a homecoming and more like an inspection. As my rental car crunched over the pristine, snow-packed gravel, the house loomed ahead, a sprawling timber and stone masterpiece overlooking the frozen gray expanse of Lake George. It was the kind of house featured in architectural digests, the physical manifestation of the American dream my father Charles Grant sold to the world. Every wreath on the massive oak doors was perfectly symmetrical. Every string of white lights was aligned with military precision. To the public, this was the sanctuary of a charitable, polished, successful family. To me, it was just a museum where I wasn't allowed to touch the exhibits. I checked my phone in the console before killing the engine. One new text from Ethan: call me if you need an extraction team. I'm on standby. I smiled, a small secret warmth blooming in my chest. My husband. The man I'd married 6 months ago in a sun-drenched garden in Denver. The man my family had never met. I texted back a simple heart, took a deep breath, and stepped out into the biting upstate New York wind. I wasn't Alexa Grant, the quietly successful landscape architect and urban planner from Denver today. Today, I was just the extra Grant, the draft copy, the one who moved away. Inside, the air smelled of expensive pine candles and tension. This wasn't just Christmas. It was a combined celebration for the holiday and my younger sister Brielle's engagement. Brielle, the golden child, the influencer whose entire life was a curated feed of our father's ego. She was in the great room holding court in a shimmering silver dress, clinging to the arm of her fiancé Mason. Mason Cole seemed decent too. Decent for this family, honestly. He came from a middle-class background, possessed a grounded handshake, and had the kind of observant eyes that made me nervous. He looked like he was trying to find a comfortable place to stand in a room designed to make everyone but Charles Grant feel small. My mother Marla fluttered past me with a tray of crystal flutes. "Oh, Alexa, you're here," she said, her voice tight and airy, eyes darting to my coat as if checking for mud. "We're just starting the gift exchange, the funny one. Hurry, grab a seat." I took a spot on the periphery of the plush sectional, accepting a glass of champagne I didn't want. The funny gift exchange was a Grant tradition ostensibly about gag gifts and laughter, but in our house, humor was often just a delivery system for judgment. We went through the rounds: ugly sweaters, a singing fish, a bizarre kitchen gadget. Then my father stood up. Charles Grant was 6'2" of charisma and control, wearing a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than my first car. "And for our traveler," he announced, his voice booming with that CEO projection that commanded boardrooms. He held out a box wrapped in heavy gold foil. "From the family, to help you get settled." The room quieted. I forced a smile, unwrapping the box carefully. I pulled off the lid and stared. Inside sat a glossy brochure and a thick paperback book. I pulled them out, my fingers turning cold. The brochure was a VIP lifetime membership to a dating app specifically marketed to, as the tagline read, women whose chances are expiring. Beneath it was a self-help book titled, How to Be Happy When You Die Alone. A few guests chuckled, the sound nervous and brittle. Brielle let out a high-pitched giggle, hand over her mouth, glancing at Dad for approval. "It's just a joke, Lex," she chirped. "Don't make a face." "Just a little nudge," my mother murmured, looking at the floor. "It's funny." I felt the heat climb up my neck, a familiar hollow ache opening up in my stomach. This wasn't a last-minute gag gift. This was calculated. It was a public undressing. I looked up to find my father smirking, his eyes devoid of any actual humor. "You've sacrificed any real chance at a family for your little hobby career, Lex," Charles said, his voice smooth enough to slide a knife between my ribs. "Your mother and I can't fix that. But maybe this app can. We just want you to be realistic." I sat there clutching the book, the humiliation vibrating in my bones. Hobby career. I managed million-dollar municipal projects. I redesigned city blocks. But to him, anything that didn't bear the Grant name was a hobby. My mind flashed back to 6 months ago. The botanical garden in Denver, the sunlight filtering through the leaves. I stood in my white dress staring at the front row. 2 chairs reserved with handwritten signs, Mother of the Bride and Father of the Bride. They had remained empty the entire ceremony. I had told myself then that the invitations must have been lost in the mail. I had told Ethan that they were just busy, that it was a mix-up. I had clung to the idea that their absence was an accident, not a choice. But looking at Charles now, watching him bask in the cruelty of this moment, the denial finally cracked. He raised his glass, turning his back on me to address the room. "To Brielle," he toasted, beaming at my sister. "The future of this family, the daughter who understands what it means to honor where she came from." I swallowed, the fury rising in my throat, tasting bile. The room applauded. Mason looked back at me, his expression confused and sympathetic, but I looked away. I placed the dating app voucher back in the box with a steady hand. My thoughts crystallized cold and sharp as the ice on the lake outside. They didn't lose the invitations. They didn't just forget my wedding. They buried it. They buried me. And tonight, sitting in the shadow of their perfect golden celebration, I decided I was done pretending I didn't know. If they wanted to play games with my life, I was finally ready to play back. To endure the stinging laughter in the living room, I had to mentally transport myself back to a day that was supposed to be the happiest of my life. A day my family had successfully turned into a ghost story. 6 months ago, under the vast vaulted glass of a botanical garden in Denver, I had married Ethan. It wasn't the royal coronation style of event my father would have thrown for Brielle, involving 500 business associates and a helicopter drop. It was intimate, fragrant with blooming jasmine, and bathed in soft, natural light. We had kept the guest list under 50 people, mostly Ethan's loud, loving family and our close friends from the city. I had agonizingly debated every detail of inviting my parents. In the end, I had hand-lettered the invitations on heavy cream stock myself. I didn't trust the regular post, so I packed them into a stiff envelope and sent them via insured overnight FedEx 4 weeks in advance. I wanted a paper trail, a guarantee. I wanted to remove every possible barrier to them attending. I convinced myself that a smaller, lower-stakes wedding would be easier for them. No pressure to perform, no speeches required, just witnessing their daughter start her life. But the memory that stuck, the one that played on a loop whenever I closed my eyes, wasn't the vows or the kiss. It was the image of 2 white folding chairs in the front row, marked with elegant tags reading Mom and Dad. I remembered standing in the bridal suite that morning, clutching my phone, staring at a thread of unanswered texts to my mother. "Getting ready now. Hope you landed okay. Let me know when you're at the hotel." Silence. I checked my email for a flight itinerary from Charles. Nothing. Ethan had come into the room looking handsome and concerned in his charcoal suit. He saw me staring at the empty chairs through the window. "Lex," he had said gently, taking my cold hands. "Do you want to postpone? We can wait. Maybe something happened." "No," I had insisted, my voice brittle. "It's probably just a mix-up, lost mail, a scheduling conflict they forgot to mention. We're not stopping." I walked down the aisle with a smile plastered on my face, but every time the camera shutter clicked, I felt like it was capturing a lie. That feeling of being secondary wasn't new. It was the architecture of my childhood. My father treated his children like his development projects. Brielle was the luxury, high-rise, flashy, expensive, worthy of press releases. I was the zoning issue that wouldn't go away. I remembered my college graduation searching the crowd for my parents, only to find out later that Dad had forgotten the date, because Brielle had secured a minor brand partnership with a handbag company that same afternoon. He had posted a 3-paragraph tribute to her on Facebook while I walked across the stage alone. But the deepest cut, the one that calcified my heart, happened when I was 19. I had refused to switch my major to business management to help the company and stuck with landscape architecture. Charles had cornered me in his study, swirling his scotch, looking at me with cold, clinical disappointment. "You're not built for this family, Alexa," he had said, his voice flat. "You're a draft we never should have printed. Brielle is the version we keep." Back in the present, inside the guest bathroom of the estate, I splashed freezing water on my face, trying to wash away the echo of that voice. My reflection looked pale and shaken. I pulled out my phone and video called Ethan. He picked up on the first ring, sitting in his home office in Denver, the glow of his monitors illuminating his face. "Hey," he said, his voice instantly soothing. "You look like you're in a hostage video. Talk to me." "It's bad," I whispered, sitting on the edge of the bathtub. I told him about the gift, the dating app for desperate women, the book about dying alone. I told him how Charles had laughed, how he had toasted Brielle while erasing me. Ethan's jaw tightened. "Are we done, Lex?" he asked quietly. "Are we done letting them pretend you don't exist?" "I just don't understand," I said, my voice cracking. "I keep telling myself the wedding was a mistake, that the FedEx guy lost the package, that they didn't know." "You know that's not true," Ethan said. "I know." I admitted, tears finally spilling over. "I think they didn't just lose the invitations. I think they chose to erase me. I think they wanted to pretend I didn't get married because it didn't fit their script." Ethan looked away from the camera for a second, typing something on his keyboard. The clicking sound was sharp and rhythmic. When he looked back, his expression had shifted from sympathetic to hard. "I didn't want to upset you before you went there," he said. "But after you told me how weird they were acting on the phone last week, I got curious. I pulled the IP logs from their family email server. You know, the one you set up for them?" I wiped my eyes. "Yeah, what about it?" "I found something troubling Alexa," he said, his voice low. "If they erased you on purpose, I think I can prove it." I stared at the screen, the air in the bathroom suddenly feeling very thin. "Show me," I whispered. "I want to know." The dining room was a theater, and my father was the director, producer, and lead actor. The table, a mahogany slab long enough to land a small aircraft on, was set with the good crystal and the heavy silver that required polishing by hand. Muted jazz filtered through the hidden speakers, Miles Davis, my father's favorite because it suggested sophistication without requiring anyone to actually listen. I was seated halfway down the table, a calculated distance from the head where Charles sat like a king. To my left was a vice president from Grant Developments who kept checking his watch. To my right was an empty chair, a visual gap that felt louder than any conversation. Across from me sat Mason's parents, nice people who looked terrified to use the wrong fork. Charles stood up, tapping a knife against his champagne flute. The sharp ting-ting-ting cut through the low murmur of conversation. He smoothed his tie, beaming with that practiced warmth that melted zoning boards and investors. "Family," Charles began, his voice rich and rolling. "It is the bedrock of everything we build. You can pour the strongest concrete frame with the finest steel, but without family, a legacy is just a building." He rested a hand on Brielle's shoulder. She looked radiant, soaking up the attention like a flower turning toward the sun. "Brielle understands this. She is the daughter who never forgot where she came from, who understands that the Grant name stands for something." He turned his gaze to Mason. "And to Mason, you're a good man's son, stable, loyal. You are the son I always hoped for." The implication hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. The son I got instead of the disappointment sitting 6 chairs away. I kept my face neutral, but under the tablecloth, my hands were shaking so hard I had to clasp them together. I slid my phone out of my lap, thumbing a single word to Ethan soon. My mother Marla, perhaps sensing the tension radiating off me, decided to help in the only way she knew how, by making it worse. She offered a nervous, fluttery laugh and leaned forward, addressing me loudly enough for the entire table to hear. "So Alexa, seeing your sister so happy, when is it going to be your turn? Your father and I just want to see you settled before we're gone. It keeps me up at night worrying about you." The table went quiet. Forks paused halfway to mouths. Brielle chimed in, her voice dripping with faux concern. "Mom's right, Lex. We just don't want you to die alone. That's why we got you the gift. Don't be so sensitive about it." I looked at them, my mother anxious and complicit, my sister cruel and petty. But it was my father who delivered the final blow. He looked down the table at me, his eyes cold and dead, stripping away the veneer of the benevolent patriarch. "If you keep pushing away this family, Alexa," he said, his voice dripping with contempt, "one day it won't be a joke, we'll move on, and no one will remember you were ever a Grant." The room seemed to tilt. That was it. He wasn't just careless, he wasn't just busy. He was actively trying to erase me. He wanted a history where I didn't exist. Something inside me snapped. Not a loud, violent snap, but the quiet click of a lock disengaging. I set down my wine glass. The crystal made a sharp thud on the table. "I'm not single," I said. My voice was even cutting through the silence. Mason blinked. "What? I'm not single," I repeated louder this time, looking directly at my father. "I've been married for 6 months." The silence that followed was absolute. Mason looked stunned, his mouth slightly open. Brielle scoffed, rolling her eyes. "Oh my God, Alexa, are you serious? You're making up a boyfriend now? This is my engagement party. Stop trying to make it about you." Charles let out a short, derisive laugh. "Unbelievable," he muttered, shaking his head at his executives as if to say, "Can you believe what I have to put up with? You are so desperate for attention, aren't you, lying to hijack your sister's night? It's pathetic." "It's not a lie," I said, my heart hammering against my ribs. "I sent invitations, overnight FedEx, tracking numbers. I gave you 4 weeks' notice." Charles slammed his hand down on the table, rattling the silverware. "Enough," he barked. "I am not going to sit here and listen to your fantasies. If you had really done that, we would have been there. We are your parents. Do not dare threaten this family's good name with your lies. If you say one more word about this secret wedding, I'm cutting you off completely. No trust fund, no safety net, nothing." "If I had sent them," I said slowly, locking eyes with him, "you would have come." "Of course we would have," he snapped, leaning forward, his face flushed with anger. "We are honorable people. But you didn't send them because you are a liar." I held his gaze for a long second. He was so confident. He believed his own rewritten reality so thoroughly that he didn't even see the trap he had just walked into. "Okay," I said quietly. I turned my head toward the large wall-mounted smart TV in the adjoining family room, which was currently visible through the open archway. "Then let's check what really happened." To understand the absolute calm that settled over me as I challenged my father at the dinner table, you have to understand what had happened 3 hours earlier. While the caterers were prepping the glaze for the ham, and my mother was frantically rearranging place cards, I had been taking a walk through the snowy grounds of the estate. But I wasn't just admiring the view. I was checking the perimeter of a digital cage I had helped build. Years ago, as a favor during grad school, I had designed and installed the estate's entire smart home infrastructure. I specified the enterprise-grade Wi-Fi, the NVR security system, and the central server that stored everything from climate control logs to family photos. Charles loved the system because it gave him total control over his environment. What he had forgotten in his arrogance was that he had never revoked my administrator access. I had slipped into the guest cottage, opened my laptop, and connected to the network. Ethan was already waiting for me on the other end of an encrypted tunnel from Denver. He wasn't just my husband. He was a senior cybersecurity analyst who hunted digital threats for a living. Today, the threat was my own family. "I'm in." Ethan's voice had come through my earbuds, crisp and professional. Scanning the logs now. If they buried it, Lex, there will be footprints. We started with the logistics. I needed to know if they were lying about the physical invitations. It took Ethan 10 minutes to cross-reference the FedEx tracking number I gave him with the estate's delivery logs. Got it, he said. Delivered 4 weeks before the wedding date, signed for at 10:42 a.m. Digital signature reads B. Grant. Brielle. She had signed for them. She knew. Keep digging, I said, my stomach tightening. Check the email server. That was where the negligence turned into malice. Ethan pulled up the admin logs for the family email domain. He found a filter rule created 2 days after the FedEx delivery. The rule was simple and brutal. Any incoming email containing the subject lines, wedding by, ceremony, or Alexa, was set to auto-delete, skipping the inbox entirely. Look at the IP address, Ethan murmured. That's not Brielle's phone. That's the desktop in the main study, Charles's personal terminal. My father hadn't just ignored my emails. He had built a wall to ensure he never even had to see them. Then came the erasure. Ethan found an internal email in the sent folder of Charles's work account directed to his PR director. The subject line was website update. The body was a single command: scrub Alexa from the official family bio and the charity board page. Remove her from the holiday newsletter draft. We are focusing the narrative on Brielle and Mason moving forward. I stared at the screen, tears pricking my eyes. It was one thing to be the black sheep. It was another to be actively deleted. But the final piece of evidence was the one that shattered any remaining hesitation I had about what I was about to do. Lex, Ethan said, his voice hesitant. I found a file in the smart home backup. The kitchen dashboard records memories, audio snippets when the noise level hits a certain decibel. There's a clip from the night the invitations arrived. Play it, I whispered. The audio crackled. Then my father's voice filled my headphones, clear and dismissive. He was speaking to my mother. We're not flying across the country for that girl's vanity project, Marla. She chose her life. We'll quietly toss the whole thing. As far as I'm concerned, we have one child. We can erase the mistake. We can erase the mistake. I sat in the cold guest cottage, the silence ringing in my ears. For 30 years I had tried to be good enough. I had tried to be worthy of the name Grant. But in one sentence he had reduced my entire existence to an error he could simply delete. I wrestled with the morality of it. Was I really going to blow up my sister's engagement party? Was I going to humiliate them in front of their friends and business partners? I thought about the small town where we lived before the money, where neighbors looked out for each other, where truth mattered more than optics. My parents had traded that community for a fortress of lies. If I stayed silent now, I was complicit in my own erasure. I wasn't destroying the family, I was just turning on the lights. They were the ones who had wrecked the room. Ethan, I said, my voice steadying, mirror the screen to the living room TV, create a folder, label it What Really Happened. Are you sure? He asked. I'm done being a mistake, I said. I'm ready. Back in the dining room, the memory of that audio clip was the fuel that kept my hand steady as I stared down my father. I felt my phone buzz in my lap. A text from Ethan: ready when you are. Charles was glaring at me, his chest heaving with indignation, fully convinced that his power and money could shout down reality. He motioned for the servers to bring out dessert, trying to bulldoze past my outburst. Let's move on, he commanded, signaling for the lights to dim for Brielle's slideshow. I stood up. Actually, Dad, I said, my voice projecting clearly over the sudden hush. Before everyone sees your version of the story, I think they should see mine. I pointed the remote at the massive screen on the wall. The image flickered. The slideshow vanished, and the stark white light of a computer desktop flooded the room. The smart TV flickered, shifting from the looped slideshow of Brielle's engagement photos to a stark, high-contrast computer desktop. The room gasped collectively, a sound like all the oxygen being sucked out of the space. I didn't look at the screen. I kept my eyes locked on my father. Folder 1, please, I said clearly. On screen, a digital file opened. It was a high-resolution scan of a FedEx delivery receipt. The date was clearly visible 4 weeks prior to my wedding. The signature in the received buy box was unmistakable, a loopy, distinctive Brielle G. "That is a delivery confirmation," I said, my voice cutting through the stunned silence. "Signed by Brielle, delivered to this house a month before the ceremony." Charles didn't blink. He waved a dismissive hand, though his face was turning a dangerous shade of red. "We receive dozens of packages a week, Alexa. It could have been anything. Samples, contracts, gifts. You're grasping at straws." "Folder 2, I commanded. The screen changed. This time it was a screenshot of the email administration panel, the very back end of the server I had configured for them. It showed a filter rule labeled Wedding Alexa Delete. "This is a rule created on the administrator account," I explained, watching Mason's parents exchange horrified glances. "It automatically deletes any email containing my name and the word wedding. It was created from the IP address of the desktop in your study, Dad. Not Brielle's phone, yours." Mason leaned forward, squinting at the screen. That's deliberate," he whispered, the realization dawning on him. "I'm not done," I said. "Play the audio." "Alexa, stop this immediately," Marla cried out, half rising from her chair. "You're ruining everything." But it was too late. The waveform appeared on the screen, and my father's voice, amplified and undeniable, boomed through the dining room speakers. "We're not flying across the country for that girl's vanity project. She chose her life. We'll quietly toss the whole thing. As far as I'm concerned, we have one child. We can erase the mistake." The silence that followed was heavier than anything I had ever felt. It was a physical weight. Marla clapped a hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with terror. Brielle looked horrified, not at the cruelty of the words, but at the way the executives and Mason's family were looking at our father. The mask had slipped, and the monster underneath was ugly. "That's you, Dad," I said, my voice shaking slightly but holding firm. "Talking about your daughter. The one you just joked about dying alone in front of these people. The one you ambushed with a self-help book tonight." Charles roared, slamming his fists onto the table. "You illegal, ungrateful little brat! This is hacking! You are breaking the law!" He turned to his guests, his charm replaced by feral desperation. "She edited that. It's taken out of context. She's trying to extort us because she's jealous of her sister." He turned back to me, venom spitting from his lips. "You owe this family everything. We paid for your education. We gave you your start. And this is how you repay us, by humiliating us." "I didn't hack anything," I said calmly. "I designed this network. Remember, I am a registered administrator. I simply accessed the system you asked me to build, and the cameras you signed the disclosure forms years ago." "Lies," he shouted. "Show the video," I said. The final file opened. It was footage from the security camera mounted above the garage recycling bins. The timestamp matched the FedEx delivery date. In the video, Charles walked out the side door holding a distinct blue FedEx box, the one I had packed with dried lavender and heavy cream cardstock. He opened it, looked inside for a brief second, and then tossed the entire box into the recycling bin with a casual, practiced flick of his wrist. Ethan, working his magic from Denver, superimposed the FedEx tracking number over the video, followed by a graphic referencing federal mail tampering statutes. The room was dead silent. Mason stood up slowly. He looked at Brielle, who was staring at her lap, and then at Charles. "You told me she never invited you," Mason said, his voice flat. "You told me she cut you off." "She did," Charles insisted, sweating now. "In spirit, she did." "I don't know if I can do this," Mason said, backing away from the table. "I can't marry into a family that would do this to their own blood and then lie about it to my face." Mason's father, a man who ran a chain of hardware stores and prided himself on a handshake deal, stood up as well. He looked at Charles with profound disappointment. "Charles, we were discussing a partnership for the new distribution center. Consider that on hold indefinitely. If this is how you treat your own daughter, I don't trust you with our people." The color drained from Charles's face. That was the only language he spoke: leverage and loss. I had just cost him. He turned to me, his eyes black with hatred. "You're dead to me," he hissed, low and dangerous. "You get nothing. I will write you out of the will. I will smear your name in every firm in the country. You will never see a dime from this family again." For the first time in my life, his threats didn't make me small. They made me free. "You already tried to erase me, Dad," I said, picking up my purse. "You tried to pretend I was a mistake you could just delete. The difference now is, I'm not letting you write my story anymore." I turned and walked toward the foyer. Behind me, I heard Marla sobbing, calling my name, begging me to come back and talk this out. But I didn't stop. I walked out the front door into the biting cold of the night and thought, this time I walk out for good. The heavy oak door of the estate clicked shut behind me, sealing the chaos inside. The sudden silence of the upstate night was jarring. It was snowing harder now, fat white flakes drifting down in the darkness, settling on my eyelashes and cheeks. The air was biting cold, a sharp contrast to the suffocating heat of the dining room. But I welcomed it. It felt clean. It felt real. I walked to the rental car, my boots crunching loudly on the gravel, a solitary sound in the vast manicured driveway. I fumbled for my phone with numb fingers and dialed Ethan. He picked up before the first ring finished. "I'm out," I said, my voice trembling not from the cold but from the adrenaline crash. "It's over." "I know," he said, his voice steady and grounding. "I heard everything through the open line. I've already changed your ticket. There's a red-eye out of Albany in 3 hours. Just drive. I'll be waiting at the curb in Denver." As I drove away, watching the glowing windows of the mansion shrink in the rearview mirror until they were swallowed by the trees, I replayed my father's final words. "You're dead to me." It should have been devastating. It should have been the moment the ground fell out from under me. But as the miles put distance between us, I realized the grief I felt wasn't fresh. I wasn't mourning the loss of a father tonight. I was just finally attending the funeral of a relationship that had died years ago. I had been grieving them my whole life, mourning the parents I wished I had, while enduring the ones I actually got. Returning to Denver felt like waking up from a fever dream. The air was thinner, drier, and lighter. When I walked through our front door, Ethan didn't ask for details or try to fix it. He just pulled me into a hug that held me together when I felt like scattering. The recovery wasn't immediate. I spent the first few days moving through the apartment like a ghost, jumping every time my phone buzzed, expecting a barrage of hate from Brielle or a legal threat from Charles. But the silence remained absolute. Then came the contrast. A week after I returned, Ethan's parents stopped by. They didn't come with an agenda or an inspection checklist. They came with Tupperware containers of lasagna and a genuine desire to see us. We sat in our small living room, eating off mismatched plates, laughing about nothing. At one point, Ethan's mom squeezed my hand and introduced me to a neighbor who had dropped by as my daughter-in-law Alexa. The ease of it, the unconditional acceptance in her voice, hit me harder than any insult Charles had ever thrown. I had to excuse myself to the bathroom to cry, overwhelmed by the realization that family could be a source of comfort, not a constant performance review. I started seeing a therapist, a woman with kind eyes, who helped me unpack the luggage of my childhood. We talked about transactional love, the idea that affection is a currency earned by compliance and image maintenance. I began to understand that walking away wasn't an act of rebellion, it was an act of survival. But Charles wasn't done trying to balance the ledger. 3 weeks after the disaster at the estate, a FedEx truck pulled up to my curb. My stomach dropped when I saw the logo, a phantom echo of the wedding invitations. The driver handed me a stiff, flat envelope. Inside, there was no letter of apology, no plea for reconciliation. There was a single crisp cashier's check made out to me for $75,000. Attached was a typed note on Charles's personal stationery, unsigned. "This is to compensate for any emotional distress and to secure your discretion regarding family matters. Our reputation cannot withstand idle gossip." Do the right thing and stay silent. Consider this a severance. I stared at the check. It was more money than I made in a year. It was a down payment on a house. It was a bribe. It was a threat. It was Charles saying I can buy your silence because everyone has a price. He was trying to turn me into a disgruntled employee he could pay off to protect the brand. Rage, hot and purifying, flooded my veins. He still didn't get it. He thought the problem was that he hadn't paid enough for the product. I took the check to the kitchen counter. Slowly, deliberately, I tore it in half, then into quarters, then into strips. I took a pair of scissors and reduced the strips to confetti. I swept the pile of expensive paper into a heap, took out my phone and snapped a high-resolution photo. I opened the family group chat, Mom, Dad, Brielle, which had been dormant since that night. I attached the photo and typed a final message. I don't sell my silence. And you can't buy my history. Consider this my last gift to you. Do not contact me again. I watched the screen. 3 dots appeared. Dad is typing. Then they stopped. Mom is typing. Then they stopped. I didn't wait to see what they would say. I tapped the info button, scrolled down, and hit Leave Group. Then I went through my contacts and blocked them one by one. Charles, Marla, Brielle. On New Year's Eve, Ethan and I stood on our balcony watching the fireworks erupt over the Denver skyline. The air was cold, but I felt warm. Are you okay? Ethan asked, wrapping his arm around my waist. With cutting them off for good, I watched a red flare dissolve into smoke. I don't know if okay is the right word, I said softly. It hurts. It's always going to hurt a little. But it's necessary. I leaned into him, finally letting out a breath I felt like I'd been holding for 30 years. I'm finally free. Spring arrived in Denver, not with a polite announcement, but with a sudden, vibrant explosion of color. 6 months had passed since I walked out of the estate into the snow, and the world looked entirely different. I was currently kneeling in the dirt, the knees of my jeans stained dark brown, wrestling a stubborn root system out of a raised cedar bed. Around me, the air was filled with the sounds of a life actually being lived. There was the rhythmic thwack of a shovel hitting soil, the hiss of a hose, and the shrieking laughter of neighborhood kids chasing each other between the rows of emerging green shoots. This was the project that had saved me. It was a community garden in a low-income neighborhood that had previously been a vacant, trash-strewn lot. I had used my professional skills to design it, fighting the city council for the zoning permits and rallying volunteers to build the beds. It wasn't a grant development luxury high-rise. It wouldn't win architectural awards or appear in glossy magazines. But it was alive. It was messy, communal, and real, everything my childhood home had never been. I stood up, wiping sweat from my forehead with the back of my glove. The therapy I'd been attending weekly had helped me understand why this place mattered so much. My therapist had told me that going no contact with my family wasn't an impulsive act of rebellion. It was a boundary born from survival. For a long time, I felt the phantom limb of those relationships, the ache for the mother I wanted, the father I wished I had. There were still nights I woke up feeling a pang of guilt, wondering if I was the villain they painted me to be. But then I would look at the peace in my own home, the absence of anxiety in my chest, and realize that I missed the idea of them, not the reality of their cruelty. Hey, boss, we brought reinforcements. I turned to see Ethan walking through the gate, carrying a flat of marigolds. Behind him were his parents, armed with trowels and a cooler full of lemonade. They waved at me, beaming. There was no inspection of my appearance, no critique of the dirt on my face, just presence. Put those by the entrance, I called out, smiling. Ethan's mom, Sarah, made a beeline for me. She was a short, energetic woman who hugged with terrifying strength. We stopped by the engraver on the way here, she said, her eyes twinkling. We thought the founder deserved a little recognition. She handed me a heavy, brushed steel garden stake. I took off my glove to hold it. The metal was cool against my skin. Etched into the surface in clean modern lettering were the words Alexa Grant Reyes, Garden Founder. I ran my thumb over the letters. Grant Reyes. For the first time, seeing my maiden name didn't make me flinch. It didn't feel like a stamp of ownership from a corporation I wanted to quit. It felt like history, something I had survived, something I had carried with me into this new life. By adding Ethan's name, by adding the title Founder, I had transformed it. It's perfect, I said, my voice thick. Thank you. You built this, honey, Sarah said, squeezing my arm. You took a patch of weeds and turned it into this. That's a legacy. She wandered off to help Ethan plant the marigolds, leaving me with the stake. I looked around the garden. A few neighbors waved at me from the communal herb bed, shouting thanks for the new irrigation timer I'd installed. These people knew me not as Charles Grant's disappointment or the extra daughter, but as the woman who fought the city for them. My resilience, which my father had tried to crush, was now serving other people. He had tried to erase me, to edit me out like a typo in a manuscript. But he failed. Every seed I planted, every friendship I nurtured, every boundary I held firm was a line in a new story. A story where love wasn't conditional and mistakes weren't fatal. I felt a profound sense of triumph settle in my chest, warmer than the sun on my back. I had refused to be bought with his hush money. I had refused to be ambushed into silence. I had built something living where he had left a void. Excuse me. I looked down. A little girl from the neighborhood, maybe 7 years old, was standing there holding a crumpled seed packet. She had dirt on her nose and a serious expression. My mom said these are the kind that come back every year, she said, holding up a packet of perennials. Where should I put them? I smiled, dropping to one knee to be at eye level with her. I took the packet and looked at the picture of the resilient returning flowers. These are special, I told her. They survive the winter and come back even stronger. I pointed to a patch of earth that got the most sunlight right near the entrance where everyone would see them. Right here, I said, handing the packet back to her. The things that matter most, you plant them where no one can erase them. As she dug her small hands into the soil, I looked past the garden fence toward the mountains in the distance. Somewhere far away, my father was probably sitting in his perfect, silent house, rewriting history to anyone who would listen. But it didn't matter anymore. I was born a Grant. But the life I chose, the life I fought for, that's mine. And this time, no one gets to write me out. And just like that, Alexa realized that sometimes you have to prune your own family tree to let the real light in. If you enjoyed this story of reclaiming your own narrative, please hit that subscribe button. Let us know in the comments below, would you have accepted the check or shredded it like Alexa did? We read every single comment of your thoughts. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Radiance. We'll see you next time.